The road to World War III began in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait and was defeated by the United States and their allies. After the First Persian Gulf War, the United States placed economic and military sanctions on Iraq, which included regular inspections of military installations and other programs involving mass weapons. In 2002, years of Iraq not complying with sanctions, the United Nations signed a bill to try and force Saddam Hussein to allow inspectors back into the country, but Saddam denied the inspectors access. In March of 2003, Saddam Hussein continued his habit of hindering United Nations inspections to ensure that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction. This paired with intelligence that Saddam was working with al-Qaeda sparked the United States into actions. The United States warned Saddam Hussein to leave the country within 48 hours on March 17th of 2003. On the third day Saddam had not left, the U.S. began dropping bombs on military bases and government buildings, followed not long after by a full-scale invasion. The United States and Britain occupied Iraq until 2011, when the last of the transitional forces were pulled out after where they left the country war-torn but desperately needed rebuilding. A war-torn country was not the only thing that was left behind in Iraq. A whole new brand of terrorists was born, calling themselves the Islamic State of Iraq. This is the Iraqi branch of al-Qaeda, who was largely under the leadership of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, until he was killed in 2006 by a U.S. bomb, which is when they rebranded. But we'll get back to ISI. The next major event on the road to World War III occurred in Syria in 2011. Syrian civilians began peacefully protesting the oppressive government and President Assad's regime. Assad, not willing to deal with the protests in his country, began murdering civilians, eventually using poison gas to kill them. A rebel group is born in Syria, calling themselves the Free Syrian Army, and begins to fight Assad and the Syrian government. The same year, the Kurds in Syria take up independence and no longer recognize Assad or the Syrian government as their own. By 2012, Iran begins to back Assad with supplies and forces on the ground. At the same time, Saudi Arabia and Turkey begin to back the rebel groups fighting the Syrian government. After this, Hezbollah, which is a Lebanese-backed group by Iran, begins to fight for Assad. In 2013, Jordan joins the fold and begins to assist Turkey and Saudi Arabia in backing the rebels with money and weapons. The United States was next to join when they secretly began training and giving weapons to the rebel group to fight Assad, but the program ended as soon as it began. Vladimir Putin and the Russian army come in next. Putin backs Assad to fight the rebels around the same time the U.S. was funding the rebels. This is where the Iraq War begins to tie in. Remember that radical group, Al-Qaeda, that radical Al-Qaeda group from Iraq calling themselves the Islamic State of Iraq? Well, they begin to march into Syria calling themselves the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria and attack both the rebels who oppose Assad and the Kurds who freed themselves from Assad. After the ISIS invasion of Syria, the Pentagon starts to train and fund the Free Syrian Army to fight ISIS, but not if they are still fighting Assad. And the program lasts about as long as the first one that the U.S. started in Syria. As ISIS is fighting the Kurds in Syria, Turkey begins to bomb the Kurds in Turkey and in Syria, but doesn't bomb ISIS, which furthers confusion about the war in Syria. Russia decides to fully intervene in 2015 by attacking the rebels who oppose Assad, then begin to bomb the ISIS oil operations in an attempt to cut their supply of cash off. This all brings us to November 2015, what seems to be a pretty critical part of the World War III coming. Just last month, two very important worldly political events happened. ISIS committed atrocious terrorist attacks throughout London, killing hundreds, bringing France into the war against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. The second event, perhaps even more important, was when a Russian fighter jet was flying in Syrian airspace near the border of Turkey, or is it flying in Turkish airspace near the border of Syria? Well, that part doesn't seem to be all that important anyways, because the Turks sent two American-made F-16 fighter jets to check on the Russian jet and allegedly issued warnings to evacuate the airspace. When the Russian fighter jet did not comply, the two Turkish fighter jets shot down the Russian jet, killing one of the pilots and really pissing off Russian President Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is quoted as saying Turkey will regret shooting down the fighter jet and immediately placed economic sanctions on Turkey, including canceling plans for a gas pipeline from Russia. Putin began sending air-to-air missiles to attach to his jets in Syria in anticipation of having to use them. He went on to accuse Turkey of buying oil directly from ISIS in secret and laid out what he says is evidence that they are doing so. At this point, nobody knows what is going to happen, but tensions are high in the world, and the United States and Russia becoming so heavily involved in the Middle East leaves everyone wondering what the tipping point for another world war is going to be.